Thank you, Kevin. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So thank you for coming and for Toda for organizing this. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of the state of democracy in the year 2024. And I have to say, it's not a very encouraging picture. I think we're hearing about a lot of the very serious global challenges in different aspects, from Kevin describing the poly-crisis of so many different types of challenges we're facing, from Volker of the sort of inadequacy of COP28 in our efforts to address climate change, and from Hugh of the sort of pre-war mood that exists in many parts of the world. But while I think it's really important to have a very clear-eyed sense of these challenges, it's equally important to look for ways forward and places of hope. And I really like Hugh's post-stuckist concept, because I think we can easily become stuckist into kind of pessimism. So I hope to also offer some ideas of how we can all be working to help promote democracy in whatever ways that we can. But sort of looking very briefly, very broadly, the second half of the 20th century saw a wave of democratization around the world. At the end of World War II, there were actually very few democracies in the world. And then with decolonization, with independence movements around the world, democracies started springing up everywhere. And with the decline of communism, even more so in the 80s and 90s. However, in the last 10 years, we've seen a complete reversal. The level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen is actually down to the level that it was in the mid-80s. And the Asia-Pacific region has actually had the most dramatic decline, where it's down to what it was in 1978. Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Latin America, Caribbean, down to levels at the end of the Cold War. So last 10 years, really across the globe, not just in one region, we are seeing this great decline in democracy. 72%, so almost 3/4 of the world's population, some 5.7 billion people, now live in autocracies, not democracies, but autocracies. Either what gets called closed autocracies, meaning dictatorships, or so-called electoral autocracies, where there are multi-party elections. However, they're not necessarily free and fair elections, and democratic institutions are being hollowed out. What's more, according to various reports, if you compare the number of countries, this is in 2022 versus 2002, that are in the process of democratizing. So in 2002, you had 43 countries in the process of becoming more and more democratic, and now there are only 14. And in 2002, you had only 13 countries in the process of becoming more autocratic, and now there are 42. So something has been happening in the last 10 years where the trends that had existed are reversing across the globe. So, and what are the impacts of autocratization, this kind of autocratization we're seeing? Freedom of expression is deteriorating in 35 countries. 10 years ago, that would have been true of 7. Government censorship of the media is now worsening in 47 countries. Government repression of civil society organizations is worsening in 37 countries. And the quality of elections, of free and fair elections, is worsening in 30 countries. So these are troubling statistics. By the way, most of them come from what's known as the V-Dem Institute, which, if you're interested, is a really good source for this kind of overview of what's happening with democracy. It's sort of judged, of course, according to a number of different criteria. I think the drivers of this process are different. They vary by country, but there are also many common themes. And it's also important to say that in some countries, we've seen something of a reversal, attempts to reverse this tendency. In 2022, in Indonesia, Anwar Ibrahim was elected prime minister, having been, previously spent many years tortured, many years in jail. So working now against all odds to bring some democratic reforms, but having a tough time of it because there are many forces pushing in the opposite direction. In Brazil, after years of Bolsonaro, Lula da Silva was elected in 2022, also working on a push towards more democracy. In the U.S., Biden beat Trump in 2021, or in 2020, but now we seem to be headed for a rematch, and it's unclear what will happen. So, and in Europe, we have a mixed picture. In Poland, we see some democratizing trends. In Sweden, I meant that should have been Holland, not Denmark. In Italy, we see something of the opposite, where there is more of a move towards autocratization. However, despite a few bright spots here and there, one has to say that looking globally, this downward trend continues. And what might be called strongmen populist leaders are winning in more and more countries by popular vote. And that's interesting to see and interesting to wonder about. Why are so many strongmen populist leaders winning? El Salvador just gave Bukele a landslide victory. In his first term, he suspended civil liberties to incarcerate 75,000 suspected gang members, which is actually 1% of the population thrown in jail with very little due process, unclear charges. There haven't been trials, very little due process. He also ignored the constitutional term limits. He wasn't supposed to be able to have a second term, but he somehow wrangled one. In India, Narendra Modi is poised to win re-election by a landslide victory. And he's making a huge effort to replace pluralism, which has always been a hallmark of Indian democracy, with Hindu nationalism, of turning India into primarily a Hindu country with Hindu values. And in fact, as many of you probably know, he recently launched his 2024 presidential campaign with the dedication of a Hindu temple, which was built on the grounds of a destroyed Muslim mosque, which in the 1990s led to riots in which 2,000 Muslims were killed. And yet this was declared as something he was doing for all of India, not just Hindus, but for all of India. In West Africa, 8 democratic countries have had military coups since 2020. So that's a huge shift in West Africa. And these were often with popular support. It was not just the military coming in and seizing and then demonstrations against it, but with popular support. And I think I'll get to this in a moment, but I think with a deep sense in many of those countries that democracy just isn't working. it isn't meeting our needs. They've had a huge problem with violent extremism increasing in that whole region of the Sahel, where there's been so much desertification. Public services aren't reaching people, so just government services not being delivered. Our government isn't working. Perhaps a dictatorship, perhaps a military coup could handle things better. So this year, as many of you I'm sure have heard, is in many ways a very critical year for democracy across the globe, because more elections are happening than have ever happened before. National elections have or will take place in 64 different countries, representing half the world's population. And so this represents a real moment of further vulnerability for democracies, especially with social media and artificial intelligence and all the ways that things are being manipulated now. There's just a lot of concerns of how well these elections will actually go, and also in what are being termed these electoral autocracies. There's a sort of promoting, oh, yes, we're having elections, but they're not necessarily free and fair in all kinds of ways. And media is often very controlled, etc. So the big question is, why is democracy declining? Why is it happening right across the globe? And to what extent is it simply failing to meet so many of the 21st century challenges, which Kevin outlined in his introductory remarks, not to mention climate change, environmental degradation, etc. So just to list some of the things that are contributing, I think there are many, many factors. I think Kevin already mentioned the increasing levels of inequality across the world. Recent statistic I saw is that the richest 1% of the world's population owns 46%, so nearly half of the world's wealth, which is just completely unsustainable. And of course, this is not only about inequality within country, but also between countries in terms of our whole world economy, where rich countries seem to benefit a lot more than others. Youth unemployment is very, very high in many parts of the world. And in some of those West African countries, it's actually as high as 80%. In many of those countries, too, we have what's called a youth bulge, where just huge percent of the population is under 25, and there just aren't jobs. We have environmental degradation, loss of species. We're starting to have loss of pollinators that could threaten our food supplies. Climate change, as has been discussed. Increase in violent conflict. I saw a recent UN report that said violent conflict is actually the highest it's been since World War II. As well as gang violence. So many Latin American countries or Central American countries now, there's just a huge amount of gang violence, which is pushing migration. Violent extremism, especially across that whole Sahel region of Northern Africa. And so much of this is contributing to mass migration, which then leads to xenophobia and all kinds of fears about we're going to lose our national culture because so many migrants are coming in. And I think also existential fears around climate change left over from the pandemic. Are we facing more pandemics? And then polarization. We're seeing what are getting termed toxic levels of polarization also across the globe in countries of all types and sizes. And this, of course, is exacerbated by social media. One of the things we're working on in this research area in Toda is trying to understand how do all these different aspects interact. Because if you just follow, it's sort of like a big knot And if you only focus on one aspect of the problem, you're not seeing how they're all affecting each other. And I think when people are using this term polycrisis, it's really looking at the interweaving of all of these factors, and what leads to the sort of rise of populist leaders, and how do they then control media, and how does social media contribute to that, and how do those divisions create more ground for autocracy? So you get what gets termed negative feedback loops, where these factors sort of support each other. And stepping back a sec, I think one thing I didn't mention, but I think is really important, is that it's given this sort of interweaving of factors, it's understandable that people look to these strongman leaders. You know, I think historically that's often happened, that when there's a tremendous amount of anxiety about the future, you just feel that things aren't working, democracy isn't working, a populist leader comes along who is going to solve the problems and is able to sort of generate support. There's often this also a kind of nostalgia for a romanticized past that never really existed. With Trump in America, we're going to make America great again. And sadly, what also accompanies this kind of rhetoric is the creation of another group, a migrant group who's threatening our way of living, or who you're pushing all the problems onto. So those dynamics also feed into this whole situation. And in the same UN report I was looking at, they said that I'm not sure where this came from, but 6 out of 7 people worldwide feel plagued by feelings of insecurity. And so you think, and that's understandable to me. There's so much that's awry in the world, that there's just a sense we can't depend upon the future. We're worried about our children's future, or young people really concerned about their own future, what's happening to the planet with climate change. So in doing this mapping of all these interacting factors, the purpose is really twofold. One is to better understand what's going on, how these factors are influencing each other. But it's not just an analytic tool. The purpose is also then to think about, okay, where can you intervene in that system? Where are points of entry? Where might you actually be able to turn some of these negative feedback loops into positive feedback loops? What can civil society do in this process? What can international organizations, what can national governments do? Where are the various points of entry, and how will they affect that whole system, so that we're not just thinking linearly, oh, well, if we do this, and this will happen, because it's more complicated than that, and we want our efforts to be effective. One example that I wanted to mention that I think is so creative, because it comes from Japan, is these, and I am interested in learning more about it, is these citizens' assemblies combined with the future design movement, where I understand that cities are getting together and having citizens' assemblies to do planning together, but they're having half the group act as though they're citizens of 2160. So 60 years, 2060, not 2160. And they wear yellow robes, so that they're really playing that role. And apparently what they're finding is that those who wear these robes are coming up with much more progressive plans that really benefit the welfare of all, because they're really taking into consideration the needs of future citizens and future generations, which also expands our notion of what a democracy should be. that it's not just for the people now, but how do we include the voices of future generations as well? So in addition, so at the Toda Peace Institute, we're doing this mapping. We're working also on a specific project on India. We want to do the mapping also for specific countries, because the map I showed you is a very generic one. But we're also launching a web platform that will be connected to the Toda platform that we're calling the Democracy Lighthouse. And the idea is to create a global guide to the organizations and networks currently researching, reimagining, and advocating democracy all over the world. Apparently, such a platform doesn't currently exist. And we want to get those from all different places, little countries everywhere, to sort of develop this sense of, yes, democracy is declining in so many ways, but there are also all these bright spots all over the world of really positive efforts being made to reverse these trends. And I'll just close with the language we've come up with for the opening page, that we're doing this in support of our passionate belief that in these troubled times, democracy, popular self-government, and a whole way of life committed to the nonviolent refusal of arbitrary power remains an indispensable planetary ideal. So.
And figure 1, I found it's very interesting, the dynamics of erosion of democratic system. You didn't mention in detail, but you mentioned that it could be usually used and effectively used in a way of analysis to the decline in the democracy. But I saw so many variable, and it's so complicated and interconnected in very complex way. So I just wondered how it's going to be. Well, I guess it's not the last model, but it's going to be evolved. But I wonder, how are you going to I don't know, evolve or elaborate this model, and how do you think it could be used to prevent to go into the declining of the democracy? That's the question. Thank you.
It's actually a tool I've used, this kind of mapping, a lot in peacebuilding work, that when we're developing peacebuilding programs for a particular country, we often do a conflict analysis first. And this kind of systems mapping helps you see how all the factors kind of interact. And then you start to think, all right, well, where can I be most effective? Which are the negative feedback loops that my programming could effectively interrupt? Maybe you see a way into media that you could do something with journalists around, media training. And then you sort of think, okay, now what's that going to affect? Or maybe we're going to also do a parallel program somewhere else with this other group, and how will they influence each other? So it gives you, I think, as Kevin mentioned, as we look at these problems, it's very helpful to have a holistic view and to see how they interact. But in terms of the map, what we hope to do, we've actually developed one that's less complicated, that's a little bit more zoomed out. So you're actually just seeing the broad areas. And then we're doing ones that zoom in on the particular areas. So maybe one particularly on media, or one on the erosion of justice systems, or whatever, these different areas, or interference with election policies. And so we're working on those more detailed ones as well. And we're going to make it interactive. So this would be on that website that I described, and you could sort of move between those different levels. But this is a generic one. And we think what would be really useful is to develop specific ones for different countries, because each country is going to be different. So these is more the broad theme. So our first one will be to develop one for India. So, yeah. I hope that helps a little bit give you a picture.
It's overwhelming to see how much there is to sort out, but I really like the way this conference started with reality-based optimism and hope. I think I have a two-part question. One is to all the panelists. How do you see all of these conflicts interacting with gender and gender issues around the world? And in terms of my second question is in terms of breaking the negative loop cycle. Do you think that the access to technology that Gen Z has could be an entry point to sort of, I mean, what would you recommend to Gen Z and millennials to sort of enter into taking action into resolving some of these conflicts, and what would be the best way to move forward for the youth in this room?
Well, actually, one of our colleagues who will be speaking later, Lisa Schirch, is working, I think, in really exciting ways on how technology can be used really positively, because there's so much talk about all the negative effects of social media and the way that that's contributing to polarization, et cetera, and how the algorithms work, et cetera. But as Lisa could talk to you about, there's also really interesting work being done on how you can use it to have dialogue and deliberative approaches to democracy at scale, where you could bring in lots of voices. And I think that's also a really wonderful way to bring in more women's voices and more other marginalized voices, because you can, with technology in these ways that they're working on, people can express their views with through technology, and have access in ways that they wouldn't if they had to show up in physical spaces. I feel really strongly that I mean, I know it's hard for a lot of young people right now to have hope about the world. And one framing that I found very useful by a Canadian fellow, Tom Homer Dixon, who he speaks very clear-eyed about the challenges ahead, especially with climate change. But one of the things he says is, okay, there's certain things that are inevitable. We're not going to go back to, a lower degree of warming. There's certain things that are impossible at this stage. But between those two poles, there's a range of possible futures. And what he talks about is the importance of using our imagination to imagine those possible futures. And personally, I have found that really useful, because I think it's true. And I think there's a danger in becoming paralyzed by a kind of pessimism. I have friends in the US who just don't want to listen to the news because they find it depressing. So for me, the question is, how do we remain really clear-eyed about the challenges, not bury our heads in the sand, but at the same time actively imagine what is still possible